Just as a quick reminder, we've got as far as test material. We'll start covering the interactions. And then close the predation and the delivery. But we're not going to do any of the symbiosis or parasitism. I will introduce the concept of symbiosis in lecture because I wanted you guys to be ready to look it over and getting ready for Friday's lecture. So, and of course you always do that. Well, let's take a look at that old exam then. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to, first couple questions anyway. Right. Okay, so the old exam is on page 119 of your lecture package, 2-119. When I mentioned it when the tutoring sessions were being discussed, I noticed a number of hands scrambling for their course packets, which gave me the impression that maybe some of you didn't realize this whole test was in there yet. I had mentioned, I guess, the first day, but that's probably a lot to take in the first day. Anyway, there it is. How about that? So, test one. It says a level of biological organization that includes all of the living things in the local area. You need to know your levels of biological organization, especially the ones that relate to ecology, because we return to those. There's all the living things, and not all the living things just in a particular species, that is the communities. That's, well, cryptic coloration is another term for camouflage. We can get to that today. In a typical muddy river such as the Mississippi, the main source of energy is dead material falling into the water, otherwise known as detritus. Overturn and the mixing of deep lakes brings mineral nutrients to the surface and oxygen to the depths. It is generally going to be rare in tropical lakes because they don't have the period of temperature change that's necessary. And it is common in temperate lakes, however. That happens to be answer B. Anytime that it's not instantly obvious what the answer is, don't despair. Read the answers. A good chunk of the time, that'll narrow things down more than you expected and make the question easier to answer. 5 says the deep ocean floor is generally less productive than the surface because it's too dark. There's no light for photosynthesis. That's why it says the deep ocean floor. Some students were questioning about the nutrients. Mineral nutrients are the most typical limiting factor of productivity in the surface layers of the world's ocean, where light is available. But as you go below the photic or lit up region, that changes. The next question, this is one of those horrible questions that makes you think a little bit, but it is a true-false question, so it's pretty easy. Double-blind procedure really only applies to experiments with human subjects. That's going to be true because there's no meaning to the concept of the patient knowing whether or not they belong to the experimental control if they're not human, because the concept would be beyond that. So, I would think. This only applies to the subjects that are experiments. which is most likely related to local extinction of species. Now there's one or two terms here we didn't cover this year, like the build formation, for example, but we definitely talked about how competitive exclusion can lead to local extinction of species. In 8, we're talking about relationships. Now, we haven't talked about that yet, so we're going to have to hold off on that one for later. Just sort of save that as a little treasure to go to in the future, kind of like a DVD of your favorite TV show that's going to be released next month or something, for example. 9, in eutrophication. A lake ages or gets choked with seaweed. That's where we're talking about eutrophic lakes. And I had you remember the term was eutrophication, but not eutrophic necessarily. Anyway, it becomes choked with seaweed because the nutrient levels are high, that being the mineral nutrients, of course. I mentioned that it is more common in shallow lakes, but you can get runoff and have that effect in any lake.
So 8, it will not be tested on.
That's right. Not this time. We'll go back to it next time.
How would you know it's going to be over?
Well, remember, resource partitioning is one of the explanations for why competitive exclusion doesn't occur, or why species can coexist. It's because they use slightly different parts of the resource. They have slightly different ecological niches. Same with character displacement. When character displacement, the two species end up using resources slightly differently if they're competing. And in both cases, that prevents competitive exclusion. So it's part of biologists. Because competitive exclusion is known to occur in the laboratory, biologists look at a lot of these relationships as ways to avoid competitive exclusion. All right, 10. If humans bring a new organism into an area, because so successful it displaces native species and disrupts ecosystems, such species are said to be invasive aliens. Alien because they're not native to the region, invasive because of their destructive impact. There has been a tendency, I was reminded of this reading a book that should have been perfectly harmless, but there has been a tendency in recent years to use the term invasive to refer to any alien species that becomes established or naturalized in an ecosystem, but that's not appropriate. The term invasive has to be limited to mean those species that are able to actually do damage to the ecosystem.
What would you call a species that was an alien but didn't do damage to the ecosystem?
It varies from place to place, but I talked about how the multiflora rose was an invasive alien in New England where it does especially well. But here I've only ever seen isolated plants at great distances from each other. They don't seem to have enough adaptations to our ecosystem to become invasive. They just establish themselves and seem to be determined to survive, but they're not making anything else go extinct.
So they're just aliens.
They would still be aliens. Even something that fails to establish itself would be alien, just not from the local area. In 11, it talks about plants prevent themselves from being eaten. The most important of these is believed to be the poisonous chemicals, or defensive chemicals, if you prefer. We talked about them in both terms. I think it says defensive chemicals in your notes. That is kind of the defining defense of plants, and that's what I said in lecture 2. We talked about some other ones, but there are actually some biologists who believe that plants do have cryptic coloration. It makes it a little harder to see, but that's obviously nothing compared to the poisons that they compare. Now, number 12 asks us directly what detritus is, and we already answered that. That is dead organisms and their waste. So it's stuff that's organic, but not currently alive. I had a discussion about zombies this morning in my lab, and so I suppose a zombie would then go from being detritus to not being detritus. Yet another reason why most people should be prepared to fight that. Which of these types of organisms, did you ever see the website that the CDC did? What to do in case of a zombie outbreak?
Rule 2, always double tap.
Rule number 1, cardio.
They have like special sprays you can use. Which of these types of organisms are most likely to have a type 3 survivorship? Remember the type 1s were the ones that survive for most of their life cycle and then are very likely to die in the older years of their lives, like human beings and elephants. The type 3s were the opposite, the ones that have such high mortality that even on your log scale, they die off very, very quickly. So their chances of surviving their infant stage is extremely low. And so we're going to compare that to a particular reproductive strategy, and it is associated with the R strategy, because these are the ones that produce extremely large numbers of offspring that overcome that very high infant mortality. Now, everything's obviously relative. Even in traditional pre-medicine human societies, the high infant mortality rates we talk about are low compared to other species. So human beings are definitely case selected with or without our technology.
Where do we see these R, O, Y, K, and W?
Oh, I just had to make up some extras just to, to fill in all the.
Well, where does that R? What does that R mean, or where does it come from?
That's related to Rmax, the ability to reproduce.
Okay.
So only R and K are real.
Oh.
There was a song about that in the 60s. Only R and K are real. Everything else is illusion.
I'm not sure.
14. You are in the tropics. Good for you. You start in the driest biome and move to the west. The order of biomes you pass through then would be desert, or desert, as the case may be, savanna, and rainforest. Remember, we talked about savanna as a tropical grassland with some trees in it. So we see the standard progression from open soil to grassy to tree cover. In our temperate regions, it would still be desert, then it would be temperate grassland, otherwise known as prairie, and then of course we're climbing the broadly temperate forest now. 15, a population is most likely to show negative future growth if its population pyramid reveals that would be because the pre-reproductive cohorts are smaller. They're the ones that are going to grow up to produce the future children, so they're predictive of the future growth. So let's see, pre-reproductive cohorts are smaller than reproductive. That happens in C. Italy was the one with the smaller pre-reproductive populations. Afghanistan was the one where the pre-reproductive populations are much, much larger, so we see the opposite effect. We predict greater future population growth in those circumstances.
So C is an example of Italy that we saw today. Is that what I'm getting?
Yes, we did talk about that today. Yes. I can actually, I got the code, I got the slides here. I just didn't know which chapter we were going to want to look at. Let's see, now that would be 53. One second. Everybody knows that stuff. All right, there you go. Here's the Italy example. Here are the pre-reproductive cohorts. You can see they're smaller than the reproductive age cohorts. In the United States, they're kind of the same size, a little bit smaller. In Afghanistan, they're much, much larger. So for this population, we predict lower population growth in the future. For this population, similar. For this population, increase.